Hey everybody, this is Matt here. This is one of my newer sections that I'm going to be doing. It's games played by grandmasters and other high level of play. This was a game played in 1963 with Robert Greenwald against Bobby Fischer. Fischer was on the black pieces, and I picked this game because it involves the Grunfeld opening, which is a video that I recently have made, and I figured it'd be a good idea to try to focus on games that are more centralized on opening videos that I've done recently, rather than just random videos. And so we're going to look at this from Bobby Fischer's perspective to kind of open up some insights for the Grunfeld Defense, so that maybe, as black, since that's who chooses to go into the Grunfeld, could have a more open eyes about different lines they can do, and kind of like this is, Bobby Fischer was obviously a very good player, one of the best in the game's history, and so this could be a very great way to demonstrate the Grunfeld Defense in action. So the play began with the Grunfeld Defense, which is pawn to d4, knight to f6, pawn to c4, pawn to g6, knight to c3, and pawn to d5. There's many variations over the Grunfeld. If you don't know the opening that well, I recommend watching my video that I've made over it to have some background on the opening. But this is going to take on the exchange variation, which is pawn captures on d5, knight captures on d5, pawn to e4, and knight captures on c3, followed by pawn captures on c3. And this is the Grunfeld exchange variation. From here we see bishop to g7, bishop to c4, and knight to c6. Just putting a lot of pressure on the center pawn in the white pawn center. Just getting ready to attack the center more and more and try to undermine the fact that white even has the center to begin with. And play from here continues with a4. This very goes off from the main line. I think it has intention of just bringing this pawn down here and try to disrupt the pawn structure on the queen side in order to weaken the pawn structure and to open up this file for the rook to come onto later in the game. From here we see knight to a5, which does two things. The first thing it does is attacks this undefended bishop, as well as prevents this pawn from advancing forward like we just mentioned. So it did two things. And players typically favor bishops over knights, so you generally won't see the bishop stay there and just get defended. Rather, we see it get moved to a2, keeping it on this diagonal where it'll be attacking the f7 square if white were to castle kingside, and it'll have this pawn pinned to the king, which is typically a very common strategy that you see from white against black. Play from here continues with c5, putting even more pressure on this pawn. Now if black chooses, you can bring the knight back to put another attacker on this pawn. And we see from here knight to e2, just defending this pawn again another time. And note that we don't see knight coming to f3, because then it could be pinned by our light squared bishop, which would not aid the defense of this pawn in that scenario. So from here we just see the pawn capture and the pawn recapture, maintaining a center pawns, the ideal center squares for your pawns for white. But it's that much weaker now that there's not another pawn here to support this pawn right here on d4. So play from here continues with b6, just defending this knight in the event that the queen or the bishop start attacking it, and at the same time it allows a diagonal to let the bishop come on so that it can put more pressure on the white center pawn that is currently undefended. So from here we see the queen coming up to d3, adding an immediate defender to this pawn, and just developing the queen to a square that would be much more active later in the game. It's also worthwhile to note that this queen moving here prevents the option to bring the bishop here, putting more pressure on the knight. So that's another reason why we might see the queen move up early rather than later, because if the bishop were to come here first, it would take away the square from the queen. So from here, from here we see castles, and now we see bishop to d2, putting pressure on the knight, trying to more or less trying to just make Fischer want to move the knight, but Fischer doesn't really mind. Fischer would rather trade the knight for the bishop and get stacked pawns than waste a turn moving the knight. And so rather than that, we just see the bishop being coded, applying pressure to this pawn that is currently defended once, but just getting more pressure and developing the bishop. From here we see castles, and now we see pawn to e6. One thing to note is that this pawn could just come up, and that would cut off more pressure on this pawn as a result, as well as just make a advancement on the queen side of the board for white. And moving this pawn up now prevents that pawn from moving up right now because there's too many attackers on it, and it would disrupt the center pawn mass that white has. Note that if that pawn came down and then you brought the pawn to e6, it wouldn't work the same way later in the game. Obviously, white did not have intention of moving this pawn yet because of the rook that it's pinned to, but later in the game. So Fischer just goes ahead and plays e6 to prevent that from happening. So later now we see rook on f to d1, just getting more indirect pressure on this pawn to be pushed up later in the game. And now we see queen to d7, putting pressure on this pawn now that is currently undefended. Next we see the bishop get traded for the knight, and now Fischer recaptures. Again, he did not mind having these pawns in exchange for having the bishop pair. So it was just something to keep in mind that a lot of top players like to do. They like to keep their bishop pair, so that that's a pretty big advantage in an open game, which this is fairly open, and if it needs to be more open, it can easily become so. So from here we see bishop to c4. Moving the bishop put a defender on the pawn with the rook, and so now we see rook on a to b4, putting it on a open file once this bishop moves out of the way. After this we saw rook to a2. I think this was in preparation of stacking the rooks to get more defenders on this pawn. Once black started putting more pressure on them. And from here we saw bishop to c6, just like we talked about. We're threatening to win this pawn, and so white has to keep defending it, and does so with knight to c3 instead of the early rook to a1. Knight to c3 does two things. First thing is it defends this pawn, and the second thing is that it's preparing this pawn to be pushed up, because it also adds a defender to this square. Black responded with, oops, sorry, it messed up. Okay, black responded with rook to b4, putting more pressure on this pawn, getting ready to win it with all the attackers on it. Now we see the pawn get advanced to d5, and we see something I think was kind of weird to see. I guess he saw a continuation that he liked more than capturing this pawn. I mean, it would really seem like capturing the pawn. I mean, the bishop's being attacked, and so capturing the pawn with the bishop would be good, since that's what you've been, that's what this entire plan has been this whole time, is to capture that pawn. But we see Fischer pull the bishop back to b7, I guess after d5, he felt that it was better just go ahead and keep the bishop pair rather than win a pawn of material. So he would prefer to keep the bishop pair than to go up in material. The other thing is that it could also be that once this pawn is gone, these pawns become much more easier to attack because this pawn is really kind of blocking off these rooks from working on this a file. So removing that pawn could really open that up to more possibilities. That's just some of the ideas that are running through my head when I see that. But play from here continues with bishop to b5, attacking the queen. Also, really just kind of guarding this pawn indirectly. There's really no way for white to attack this pawn anymore, and it also cuts off the rook's communication. The rook can't just back up now, and the rook really has nowhere to, although it's not being attacked and it's on an outpost, it really can't come back towards its home, back towards black. It's really kind of stuck in white's territory with this bishop moving here. So it's limiting the rook's mobility. From here we see the queen move up to d6, putting another defender on the rook, as well as just getting out of the way from the bishop attacking. And now we see the knight come back. I'm not really sure why Greenwald moved the knight back. The Fritz analysis gave black's advantage at about 1.5. So it was an inaccurate move to make, and as a result, black is going to be able to really start attacking white, and this game's going to end relatively soon from this stage of the game. We see the pawn capture, followed by the pawn recapturing, followed by the queen capturing, which it looks on the surface like it's losing material, but black can just win the material back immediately, which we'll see. After the queen captures, the bishop captures, and the rook captures the bishop, it appears like white is up a knight, but now the rook comes to b1, forcing the knight to come to c1 and winning back the material, as well as pinning the bishop to the king. So it really wasn't losing material. It was just simply getting to this stage of the game right here, which is favored in black because white's position is really the bishop's pinned, and the king, it's just a really cramped position. From here we see the rook come to e8, getting ready to put more pressure on this bishop, and now we see f4 trying to give the king some breathing room, but after rook to e1 and rook to f2, the only way to defend the bishop, we just see bishop to f8, and at this stage right here we see that Greenwald resigned because there's really no way to prevent the bishop from coming here and taking off one of the defenders of the pinned bishop on the king. And so this position was just winning for black, and Fritz has the advantage at over 3, which is more than enough advantage for this level of play to be a win. And so this is the game against Fischer and Greenwald, and this is a very good example of the Grunfeld Defense. It's an exchange variation. It did deviate from the main line relatively quickly. We saw it, I think it was move 8. Let me check real quick. At move 8 was a deviation of the main line, but I think this is a really good example for the usage of the Grunfeld Defense, and hope that this can help you improve your game a little bit, and I'll be getting more of these kind of videos up later on. So thanks for watching, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.